COVID-19 is not the great equaliser. We know that it affects people over the age of 60, those who have underlying health problems, and those who come from a black and minority ethnic background. The murder of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter protests around the world in the United Kingdom and the United States, as well as the taking down of statues, has made a lot of people perhaps unclear about why Black Lives Matter and what the movement is really about. And this video is really to talk about that in more detail. Why do Black Lives Matter and how do we move forward? For the United Kingdom, black people make up 3.3% of the British population. And if we look at black and minority ethnic populations in more detail, they make up 14% of the British population. And if you are from a minority and ethnic background, you're more likely to be poor, you're more likely to be excluded from school, you're more likely to be unemployed and suffer higher work stress, you're more likely to be overqualified, less likely to be promoted, and more likely to be in prison. And if we look at health outcomes, we know there's a huge difference between black people and white people. We know that black women are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth. We know that black men are twice as likely as white people to be diagnosed with prostate cancer. They're more likely to die from prostate cancer. Black people are more likely to feel less involved and supported in cancer care across the board. As well as this, we know that black people are more likely to suffer severe mental health symptoms and less likely to receive help for their mental health problems. As well as this, black people are more likely to be sectioned under the Mental Health Act. We know that black people are more likely to have high blood pressure, they're more likely to be diagnosed with asthma, and they're more likely to have severe asthma and be hospitalised. If we look at HIV care, we know that heterosexual black men are more likely to receive a late diagnosis of HIV, and that carries a worse outcome. As well as this, we know the rates of sexually transmitted infections are highest in Afro-Caribbean populations in the United Kingdom. Lastly, we also know that South Asians and black people have the highest levels of kidney disease and more likely to need kidney replacement through dialysis. As well as this, we know that black and South Asian people are more likely to have type 2 diabetes. In order to explain these health differences, many people discuss genetics. Surely that there are genetic differences between black people and white people. However, when we look at what affects a person's health, we know that genetics only really makes up a small part of that. If we look at really what affects a person's health, it's the social environment and the economic environment that people live in, i.e. the place they live and the place that they work, the access to food, green spaces, and things of that nature. As well as that, we know that access to healthcare also does make a big difference. And we know that ethnic minorities do have problems accessing healthcare. If we look at genetics further and the assumption that genetics really is a big part, we must look at race science, or the study of differences between races. Many people would point the finger at 1930s Nazi Germany as the main cause of the rise of race science. However, in the UK, we do not need to look further than our own shores. One of the big centres of race science was in the United Kingdom, in London, specifically University College London, or UCL. Francis Galton was the cousin of Charles Darwin, and he was obsessed with trying to find differences between people who look different, i.e. differences between members of different races. But we know that from modern genetics, that the differences between two people of the same race is likely to be bigger than the differences between people of a different race. For example, there are more likely to be bigger genetic differences between two black people than, for example, a black person and a white person. In Adam Rutherford's book, How to Argue with a Racist, he talks about this in a bit more detail, and I'm going to quote him directly. He says, "We think of certain areas, lands, or people being isolated either physically or culturally, and these boundaries are insurmountable. But that is neither what history nor genetics tells us. No nation is static, no people are pure. Neither race nor racism has foundations in science. Race is real because we perceive it. Racism is real because we enact it." We can't really talk about why Black Lives Matter without mentioning history, specifically Empire, British Empire, and colonisation. This is a sensitive topic for many. Those who believe that empire was a fundamentally good thing argue that empire was designed to civilize the modern world. This goes under the assumption that the rest of the world simply wasn't civilized, but this just wasn't the case. There are many civilizations around the world with their own cities, towns, technology, infrastructure, law, politics that already existed. As well as this, there may be some good byproducts as a result of the British Empire and colonisation. For example, the common language that we all speak, English, which is spoken quite widely throughout the world. As well as this, trade routes through the Commonwealth. Those who do believe empire was good also mention that railways, roads, politics, law were also very, very important. And these are important legacies of empire that benefited the countries now that the British Empire is over. However, we must acknowledge that British Empire and colonisation came at a huge human cost. The British slave trade affected the lives of millions of black people who were taken from Africa to the West Indies and many parts of Central and Southern America for the purpose of harvesting crops, which were then taken back to the United Kingdom, and those crops were sold at a profit. And we cannot fathom the huge human costs that must have had. Many people who are in defence of British Empire often say that it was the British that abolished slavery. However, at the end of the slave trade, it was the slave owners, not the slaves, that are reimbursed for their financial losses. Perhaps one of the most disturbing things that I've seen recently is something called the doll test, which is used to identify prejudices in children. They're asked to identify which characteristics they'd associate with a black doll and a white doll. Overwhelmingly, the vast majority of children do associate the black doll as being bad or evil. Perhaps it's not that surprising when we look at the representation of ethnic minority authors in children's literature. If we look at book titles, only 5% of children's books are written by an ethnic minority author. Whilst the proportion of books and book titles have been increasing over the last decade or so, we know that children's book authors from an ethnic minority only publish half as many books as white children's book authors. So how do we move forward? Angela Davis, an American civil rights campaigner, said that it's not enough not to be racist, that we must be actively against racism, i.e. we must be actively anti-racist. Ijeoma Olusoga perhaps goes one step further to define what anti-racism is. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including yourself. It's the only way forward. And we must uncomfortably look at our own prejudices that we have against other people. And it's incredibly important for us to educate ourselves. I remember growing up in primary school and in secondary school, and the history that was being taught was of the Middle Ages, the Tudors and Stuarts, the kings and queens of the United Kingdom, almost 500 years ago. And in secondary school, we talked about the French Revolution, the American Civil Rights Movement, but we did not talk about British Empire and colonisation. If we look at history, black people have been in the United Kingdom for almost 800 years. So how do we educate ourselves? Well, there's plenty of places to start, and a lot of them are on the internet. There's videos, podcasts, books about the history of black people in the United Kingdom and black people across the world. One of the best examples are from Professor David Olusoga, who has done countless documentaries, written a very large book called Black and British, and done many media appearances about this topic in quite significant detail. Just 4 years ago, there was a film called Hidden Figures, which recounts the story of 3 black women and their important contribution to NASA putting the first man on the moon. As well as this, there was one particular music track that really resonated with me, and that's from the hip-hop artist called Dave. And he performed at the Brit Awards in February 2020 and talked about what it means to be black and British in the United Kingdom and the mass prejudice that black people face every single day. I cannot overemphasize the importance of educating ourselves about this topic, and I will put some links in the description below. One thing I wanted to mention was something called the Jhalak Prize, which celebrates minority authors, both fiction and non-fiction, and has been running for the last 4 years. The long list and the short list of the Jhalak Prize has many suggestions for book recommendations, which you might find helpful.